Everybody, I'm Joe Woodcock, Community Manager for Study Help here at the Student Room, and I'm here to host our TSR Answers session with University Minister Michelle Donelan today. I will introduce the Minister in a moment, but first we wanted to give a little bit of context about why we're here today. A couple of weeks ago, when the government announced a U-turn on the grading process, we at the Student Room decided it was time for us to use our collective voice to communicate the significant concern and confusion students were and still are experiencing. We called for urgent clarity from key decision makers and have been working behind the scenes to get this information from the people that really need it. We've been spending the past couple of weeks speaking with the Department for Education and discussing the best way to get students the clarity they've asked for. So now I'd like to introduce University Minister Michelle Donelan, and perhaps it might be useful to ask you to talk about your role a little bit, what it covers, and how you maybe work with others in the Cabinet, and including Nick Gibb, the State Minister for Schools, and Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe, and delighted to join you today. My role is Universities Minister, so I focus exclusively on universities. Apart from some little bits that are added on to my role, my key focus is on the university admission system, working with universities, and also the whole process and that journey. So in law, universities are actually autonomous in the UK, so they're independent institutions, so very different to the setup with schools. But I have a very strong working relationship with them and work hand in hand over this problem that we've had the last few weeks. And at the heart of my work actually has been exactly what you've talked about, Joe, trying to get those messages out to students and give them that clarity and that certainty that they deserve, because it has been a really confusing time for them and also a very stressful time. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come on the Student Room today to really address some questions direct, because sometimes it can be quite tricky to talk to students and to get that message out there on the media. Nick Gibb, that you referenced, the school minister, works with me here at the Department for Education. So we're regularly talking about issues that will affect those that are looking to go to university and the ramifications of things like A-level results. And our boss is the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson.
Thank you so much. We've had so many questions come through, so we are going to try our best to get through as many of them as possible, and we've picked out some recurring themes to hopefully get the answers that students need. So do bear with us. Any questions that we don't get to will be in the thread after, and we'll try and answer them for you. So we will jump straight in. One of the biggest questions that students have been asking, and it's looking back a little bit, but it's from our user Sark and Spark. Do you think the handling of exam grades this summer was acceptable?
Yeah, so that's been asked of the department and other ministers before. The Secretary of State's apologised, and so has the department, and I'll go on record here as well and apologise for what's happened on behalf of our department, because it wasn't acceptable to put students under that stress and what's happened, and that isn't what we wanted. I think it's fair to say that I believe, and I know so do my counterparts here at the Department for Education, that actually the best way of assessing students is via exams. We didn't want to cancel exams. We had to, because we had to prioritise public safety and public health, and because of coronavirus. And then we worked with Ofqual to try and produce a system that would allow for those grades to be given out in the fairest way. And once they were, we had results day, and the days after, it was very, very apparent that something had gone wrong in that algorithm, and there were gross anomalies that were appearing on people's result slips, and it wasn't fair, and it wasn't going to unlock those choices and those chances that they deserve. So we took swift action on that then.
Thank you so much. One more question, just kind of looking back before we look forward. We have a question here. We have a large community of private candidates on the Student Room who have increasingly felt left behind by the grading decisions this year. So I have one here from our user MSK. Why was action not taken to help private candidates who weren't given grades? We were assured that universities would be flexible, but they clearly weren't. I was rejected for having A star AB for an offer of A3 A's. I can afford to take another gap year, and the caps you initially put on admissions numbers meant that universities couldn't be flexible. For many of us, we retook to get into a specific university and now have wasted a year. What action will the government take to help us?
Yeah, so on this issue, it has been difficult. So on private candidates, a number of them, they did get grades, and it sounds like the student that contacted you did get some grades. Some haven't been able to get those grades. So we tasked Ofqual with coming up with solutions for private candidates, and they published information and guidance on the evidence that could be utilised for dishing out those grades. And there were certain circumstances where there simply wasn't enough evidence. And so for those students, the best advice is to try and take those autumn examinations and get some grades that they deserve. And we've got to remember this is all because of the pandemic and the fact that we didn't have the usual exam series as we normally would. In the circumstances of that individual questionnaire where they just missed their offer, we did ask universities to be as flexible as possible. We particularly drew attention to private candidates, but there are some courses that are extremely competitive and some where they simply will not accept lower grades. And so in those scenarios, given the fact that universities are autonomous, there is nothing we could do, but we have been working with them to build capacity so that they could try and get as many students in as possible, both this year and continually for next year.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we should look forward now and start addressing some of the concerns students have moving forward. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact on the 2021 exam season. We've had lots of questions about how the new cohort of Year 13s are likely to be affected, both by school disruption and the knock-on impact that this year's changes in the examination system is likely to have. The first question here is, will there be any further changes to the A-level exams? We know there's been some proposed changes by Ofqual, but not much has changed, especially around STEM subjects. And just to piggyback on top of this question, something that I think is important is, do we know if the chances that A-levels and GCSE exams are going to be delayed this year? I'd like to know if it was possible to get a rough timeline and when we could find out a bit more.
Yeah, so I think until recently, the media have focused on this cohort and not on next year's cohort. And so that worries me that the 2021 students, as we refer to them, will feel a little bit like we've forgotten them. So I just want to reassure them that we haven't, first of all. They're at the top of my agenda, the top of this department's agenda. And in relation to, I've spoken already about how we value exams, how we think they're the best form of assessment. So we're working towards examinations next year for both A-level and GCSE. Of course, we're constantly updating our guidance and our plans in line with public health and safety. That has to come first. Ofqual have published some guidance already, as you pointed out. That was on the 3rd of August. And it gives teachers more choice on certain areas to allow and accommodate for the fact that students haven't been in school or college for a substantial amount of time. We're also investing a lot of money in catch-up programs too, to help really, well, do what it says on the tin, catch these students up if they have suffered from being at home during that time. And the other message is that universities are fully aware of what's gone on. You know, they're going to be flexible again next year. They appreciate what has happened. My job to talk to them and to keep reinforcing the fact that students that are going into their final year of A-levels have had a really difficult time, and that may be reflected in their results.
If universities are being told to be flexible again next year, considering that there might be some deferred students, as you said previously, universities are independent. Can we be sure that universities will take that advice on and will be flexible for students?
So first of all, on the deferred issue, so what I did straight away after we did that change in terms of the exam results issued, was set up a task force that had lots of different representatives from across the sector, and within sort of a day or two, we managed to get a commitment from that task force that all universities would enable those that were now eligible for their first choice or insurance offer to get that offer. And they would work to really try and get as many as possible into university this year. And we've been supporting them in that mission to increase capacity. So what we've done is we've removed the student number control that you referenced. We removed the student number cap that was on medical places, and we put in additional money to support that, and also on veterinary places as well. We gave additional money to universities on those high cost subjects to facilitate them recruiting more students. And so we are trying to remove all the barriers that might be in the way of a university taking a student this year. That means that we're in a much better position than we were the other week. The number of students that are being asked to defer is going down and down and down. Now, my other priority needs to be ensuring that we're building capacity next year to make sure that there are no students disadvantaged by whatever number of deferred students are then reallocated to the following year. So this isn't a one-year problem. I'm very alive to that fact, and at the heart of all of my decision making and all of my thinking over the next few weeks and months will be students and making sure that their interests are prioritised.
Okay, I think you've referenced quite a few questions that we'll be coming to now.
Sorry.
Just to say that we've seen something similar. We had a poll in March, and 70% of our users said that they felt year 10s and year 12s had been forgotten about by the government. We've had lots of questions about the kind of impact on students planning on going to university in September 2021. I picked out the few of our most common, so we'll dive into these now. How is fairness for new year 13 students going to be ensured, given that there has been disrupted schooling and they will face extra competition from 2020 applicants, in some cases with inflated centre assessed grades applying for the same courses? How will that be managed so that no new year 13 student will be disadvantaged?
So first of all, on your point about students being forgotten, that's certainly not what I want. It's not what the department wants. Obviously, it's hard to sometimes cut through some of the messages and get those messages into the media. What I try and do is I do a lot of work with you guys, with the student room. You've got my blog up. I try and do some other student-facing media and comms as well to try and get that message out there, because the last thing I want is our students with a number of questions that aren't answered or feeling uncertain about their future. Now, in relation to ensuring that they're not disadvantaged next year, that is one of my priorities, building that extra capacity into the system. We've got the catch-up fund to try and support them. I know that schools and colleges will be prioritising this as an area over the next few months. And we will be working to ensure that when they get those results, that they can unlock those places at university. So rest assured, that is one of our top priorities. Now, we may not have all of the answers here today, but it doesn't for 1 second mean that students have been forgotten.
Okay, and I suppose putting myself in the shoes of students, it's completely understandable perhaps why those answers, we're not there yet. You know, it's only a couple of weeks since results day this year. But I suppose a student would be looking at kind of rough timelines and when will they know that they're going to be secure? Do you have a kind of rough timeline on when more information about this will be available?
So students have gone back this week, or they're going back next week in some cases. I know that from my own constituency. So they're going to start the process of completing their A-levels and continuing to study. They're working to those examinations next year. Obviously, we're living in the midst of a pandemic. Things can change at any moment. We all know that. We've seen that over the last few months, but we want to provide as much certainty as possible. So we've said exams will go ahead next year. Ofqual produced that guidance on the 3rd of August to clear up around some of the subjects and to give teachers the tools and the information to be able to then teach adequately. We're in conversations with UCAS, whether there's any sort of flex within some of those deadlines that's there if students want to go to university. It's also important to note at this point, whilst I'm the university's minister, so I talk about university quite a lot, there will be a number of students that want to go on to further education courses, apprenticeships, or straight into employment as well.
Okay, thank you so much. If we move on, another question here, roughly around the same thing, but is there going to be a reconsideration on how universities accept students next year? The method we saw this year has not worked in terms of bridging inequality gaps. So would you direct universities to consider more contextual offers and potentially lower grades based on the fact that many of us had not had extra classroom time, and that's from our user 2 versions?
Yeah, so actually this year we've seen record numbers of students getting their first choice in terms of university, and we've seen some really great work in terms of access and participation. So that includes those that are from disadvantaged backgrounds, getting their first choice university and going to top tier universities. So progress has been made. The Office for Students, who's the regulator of the university sector, has done great work in this space. So every university has to produce an access and participation plan, which they're accountable for, where they have to detail how they're going to do outreach work, how they're going to attract, and they're going to support and take on and ensure that students then go on to complete their courses if they're from disadvantaged backgrounds. That we all know that this cohort and every cohort that is in any stage of education at the moment has had an impact, as we all have, on our lives. And there will be different ramifications for that. That's why we've introduced the catch-up fund. That's why schools will be prioritising supporting these students. And we'll continue to monitor what happens. And I'll continue to work with universities to make sure that they understand, but they do, you know, they've been living throughout this pandemic just as we have, and they recognise the challenges that students have faced during this and will continue to face as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of more specific questions about the application process for the next year. One of our users posted asking how you would expect some students to manage an Oxbridge/medicine deadline on the 15th of October, personal statements for which some have not been prepared or guided, university admission exams across 3 months, and then not to forget on top the A-level mock exams in early mid-November. We year 12s, now year 13s, have been quietly suffering in the background for some time now. We need clarification, we need extended deadlines. So I suppose my question to you is, will you be looking at discussing with UCAS extending those Oxbridge medicine dentistry early deadlines?
Yeah, so my first point would really be, I do get how stressful this must be for students. They've just gone back, or they will be going back next week to school or college where they haven't been for months on end, and then suddenly they feel like they've got to get all this information sorted and exams done and applications done. And I know it's easy for me to say, but I think the first thing you need to do is talk to your teacher about those requirements and get the support from your school and college, and they will be prioritising it as well. We're already in talks with UCAS about what we can do over some of these deadlines. Oxbridge are autonomous organisations, like we said before, and I believe that they don't have the flex within their systems, they've said, to be able to move those deadlines along. We'll continue to have those conversations and look at things like medical examinations, etc. And there is a great will to be as flexible as possible where it is possible, but we will continue to work towards moving those deadlines where we can.
Okay, thank you. Given that university this year will have an overflow of medical, dentistry and veterinary students, and many such students that have been asked to defer, even with caps lifted for 2020 places, will you consider keeping the caps lifted for 2021 and 2022 entry? Or will those entering years 12 and 13 this year be disadvantaged by having fewer places available to them at each university due to overflow from previous years?
Yeah, so just to sort of clear up here, because it can be quite confusing, there was something which we introduced this year as a temporary measure to try and stabilise the admission system, which was called temporary student number controls, which we removed, and they were only ever an initiative for 1 year anyway. So that's something that's an aside. Then there was also what has been there traditionally in terms of caps for medical places and veterinary, the really high cost premium courses. Now, the way that it works in government is you don't decide policies for years and years in advance. But what we've been doing is trying to make sure that as many of those students as possible go this year to actually relieve the pressure on next year. But across government, we are, as I said before, very alive to the issues around next year. We're having those conversations, we're talking to those universities, and we're trying to look at what we can do to make sure that there is no disadvantagement faced by these students of the 2021 cohort.
Okay, I think all these questions on these topics can be summed up in this final one from our user Amina T. And I suppose it goes back to simply, will it be harder to get a university place next year in 21 due to the deferred places of applicants this year?
The straightforward answer is no. That's my priority, to make sure it's not. Yeah, I am in politics to give people opportunities, not to close doors. And I passionately want to help support students to get to where they want to be in life. We've already took a number of measures, as I've outlined, to bolster the number of places available this year. That has proved successful. We are minimising day on day the number of students that are going to have to defer to next year. And then in addition to that, we've already started the conversations about how we can bolster the capacity for next year as well. It's also important to note that we are at what we call a demographic dip at the moment in terms of the number of students. Over the next few years, it's going to bulge. So universities have been preparing for more students anyway. So there's a possibility to build on some of that work that's in train.
Okay, thank you. I think it might be appropriate now to look forward and maybe start asking some questions to students who are going to be starting university or going back for their second or third years. It's obviously an incredibly difficult time for them as well. So our first question here is, what steps are being taken to mitigate the risks of a COVID outbreak as freshers arrive at university in September and October?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we want all students and staff to feel safe in the campus environment and when they're at their accommodation. So we already publish guidance to steer universities to make those risk assessments and put those processes in place. And we're publishing additional tweaks to that guidance and updates next week to give even more clarity and answer some of the questions that universities have had. So when a student goes to university, they'll find it's a bit different if they've been before to that. Like if they're going into their second year, they'll see many more hand sanitizer stations, one-way systems potentially, social distancing regulations, and also innovation in the form of blended learning, but also in the form of socializing. I know a number of universities are planning their freshers pairs to be outside. So there's different things that universities are doing to make sure that it's not only academically rigorous in terms of the experience that students get, but also that it's enriching with all the other bits that make up a quality educational experience. And we all know that university is much more than just the academic side. It's the way of life, and we don't want students to feel that they're not getting any of that when they're there. But our safety and security of students is the priority here, hence why it will be different to other years.
I suppose for some of our more anxious students who are nervous about going to university, would you be able to say that they should feel safe starting their university place this year?
So I think we need to remember that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and that we have social distancing and different regulations and rules in place across society. And that's all to minimize the risk of getting COVID and to passing it on. So we can never say there is no risk at all, no. And also this depends largely on everybody adopting these rules and these regulations. So if universities open and students don't follow the social distancing guidelines, then we will have a problem. So if everybody does their bit and follows the rules, follows the regulations, we'll be in a much better position. But I can confidently say that universities have done everything that they can do to make sure that campuses are safe, they're secure, there are the guidelines in place, they're going to communicate those to universities. We're publishing additional guidance next week. SAGE are also publishing some guidance tomorrow. So there's enough information and tools out there. We will need people to then follow that so that their campuses can remain open and they can continue to get that student experience.
Okay, thank you. Moving to another question, one of our users who has asked, why should my tuition fees be the same if learning is being provided online? Just on this as well, I'd be interested to hear what advice you would personally give to a student who, and we've seen this on site, who may be tempted to defer their place and go to university when they could have, the full university experience, especially if fees are likely to be the same this year as in previous years.
Yeah, so there was a lot of media speculation about this a few months ago, that we were going to see mass deferrals of students to avoid having to go to university during times that are very difficult and different. But on balance, I think students decided, well, university is more than potentially the first term or the first year. And whilst things will be different, they won't necessarily be inferior. In fact, a number of universities have taken great learnings from the innovation that they've developed, and they've had even longer to do that now. They've had all of the summer and months, so we're expecting an even higher quality of innovation, especially in the socialization of students and the added extras. Now, I don't know of one university that is offering courses purely online that used to be in person. And if there are examples, I would welcome students to get in touch with me, then I could have a look at that, because the main offer really on the whole is a blended offer. And that is normally lectures are done remotely, whereas smaller tutorial groups are done in person. And it's important to remember though, that we still expect the quality to be there. Just because it's a different medium of projecting those messages, we certainly expect the quality to be there. And for those courses to be fit for purpose and leading to those outcomes, just like any other year. If a student is unhappy and they don't think that they're getting that quality, they don't think they're getting that level of service, there is a process in place. First of all, they should complain to their university. And if they're not satisfied with that, they can go to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator and lodge a complaint with them.
Okay, thank you. Going to another question now. A user that is in their second year of their degree, about to go into their third. I was doing very well until the pandemic hit. I had to take 2 exams and 2 assignments at home. For a number of reasons, this led to me getting bad grades on these assignments. Obviously, second year counts towards my overall grade. What can be done for someone like me now? It'd be great if you could address the question directly there, but I also suppose, talking slightly wider, there will be students that who find online learning difficult for numerous reasons at university and school level, and that is going to be difficult for some students. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that as well, if possible.
Yeah, sure. So in relation to the individual student, the best advice is certainly to talk to your university. Every university has a different system for their assessments and their examinations. But universities do have that discrepancy to be lenient and to be understanding. And so my advice would be go to university and explain what's happened. And to anybody else that's listening that may experience those problems in the future, I would say as soon as you feel that you're having issues or you're not performing as well as you could do, and it is potentially because of remote learning, etc., then please talk to your university straight away. We have seen some really great statistics in terms of how remote learning has helped those that are disabled, but I do take on board that there has been problems with it. We've seen that across all sectors, in fact, and universities had to act very quickly to get content up and online, and now they've had longer. So going back in September, we should see much more innovation, as I spoke about before. We've also seen some problems around some students not having the technology. And we've worked with the Office for Students to ensure that universities have more flex on the money that they're allocated, so that they can spend some of their access and participation funds to bolster their existing hardship funds to help with things like computers and printers, etc.
Thank you. I wanted to move onward even more and speak. We have a question here. What, if any, action will the government be taking to support graduates trying to find jobs in a post-coronavirus economic climate?
Yeah, so one of our key priorities as a government has been to try and protect jobs. So we've seen that with things like the furlough scheme, with the business grants, even Eat Out to help out in terms of the assistance to the hospitality sector. And we will continue to support businesses and try and really protect those jobs so that people can both stay in jobs, but also have jobs to move into, including graduates. There is a blog that I've done on DfE's website that is top tips for graduates, which offers a number of links to helpful tips, including to the National Career Service, which we've just invested more money in as a government to be there to give the advice and the information, especially to graduates entering into a very difficult jobs market. Another resource that we've created is the Skills Toolbox, and that links to a number of courses that may add value to students' CVs, so things like coding and stuff that they might not have necessarily studied at university. And I remember when I graduated from university, just how difficult it was for me to get a job. And that was not at a time of a pandemic. So I do understand the concerns on this. And we're doing as much as we can across government to protect those jobs and to ensure that you have those careers to go into.
Thank you. We're having a couple of questions come in from international students that I'd just like to ask. A common theme is, will people with pre-settled status be eligible for student finance to start a course on the 2021-2022 academic year? If yes, would it be possible for them to apply for a student loan for the whole course length? We're getting a couple of questions on this. I wondered if you could help at all.
Yeah, so the way that the student finance system works is changing slightly because obviously we've left the European Union, and so the cohort of 2021, if they are from the European Union, they won't be able to access the same benefits that they did before in terms of student finance that you allude to. Now, the way it works is the amount of time that a student has lived in the UK for. So if they've lived for 3 years here, then they may well be eligible. So it all depends on the amount of time they've lived here. And there are a number of technicalities around this. So the best advice really is to double check this. Ring up the student loan company around your specific example, because I get a load of letters on this very subject, and it depends on the specific examples that are given. So for instance, we have some people that may be British citizens, but they've not been in the UK for the last 3 years. So don't just assume because you're a British citizen that it will necessarily unlock that student finance.
Thank you. I think we're running out of questions and we're running out of time. I just wanted to thank you for your time. I wanted to end the session with one more question. Following the surveys that we ran over the results period, we found that 72% of GCSE and 80% of A-level students felt their mental health had been impacted by the uncertainty and the confusion, the grading process. What is the government doing about the mental health crisis amongst young people? And that's from our user, Student.
Yeah, so this has always been one of my top priorities as Universities Minister, way before the pandemic hit, really. Because if you look at the stats, students are much more susceptible to mental health problems, especially at their time in university. And it's something that I pushed universities to really focus on. My first letter to the sector at the beginning of the pandemic was echoing this message that whilst a number of students would be away from campus and moved home, please actually upscale your mental health services rather than decrease them, but utilize technology to deliver them. As a government, we've invested 5 million additional funding for mental health services that students can tap into. And then we've also worked with the OFS to launch Student Space, which is delivered by Student Minds, which is a top-up additional service to the existing mental health support that's there and available. And it's something that I will be monitoring over the next few months and continuing to push universities to go further on this, because I think it is such an important area that can be so detrimental to both one's life and also one's studies. And the last few months may have compounded and created more problems. So it's something that I know I'm extremely vigilant about. And I would just say to any student out there that does suffer from mental health problems, when they're at university or before they're at university, do tell somebody at either your college or school or your university and get that help. There is no stigma in getting help, because that is the only way that you can deal with these problems.
Thank you. Just to say, any of the materials that we've kind of referenced in this talk, including some mental health charities, we will link to afterwards in the conversation. And equally, what we'll do is we'll go through, if there's any very specific questions that TSR can help with, we'll try and address them. I think we've covered most of the main topics. So I think that's us done today. Thank you so much, Minister, for your time.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
yeah, and have a lovely day.
And you, thank you.